So I don't know whether you're enjoying the latest David Attenborough series, Frozen Planet 2. I am, certainly. It encourages us, doesn't it, to marvel at the wonders of God's creation. Its immense variety and diversity. And aren't we a fortunate generation? The first generation we are to be able to see these living things close up in glorious colour on our TV screens in the comfort of our living room, rather than freezing to death for weeks in the Arctic waiting to see some rare animal. Isn't that great? We're very fortunate. And such programs, I think, are a lovely demonstration of what a great God we have. He didn't just create a ladybird, he created thousands of different species. There are 6,000 different species of ladybirds. And we don't know how. I often wonder, did God sit down one morning and say, oh, maybe we'll have one yellow one with 7 spots on today? Or did he establish the laws of nature in such a way that they would lead to such a rich diversity? We don't know, do we? And one of the things that comes across when we think of the richness of God's creation is the importance of different climates and different seasons of the year. Every year, without fail, we experience God's faithfulness as we see winter and springtime and summer and autumn. We've just been singing summer and winter and springtime and harvest, sun, moon and stars in their courses above, join with all nature in manifold witness to thy great faithfulness, mercy and love. And I've no doubt that in writing that verse, the writer had in mind God's promise to Noah after the flood. We can spend a few minutes thinking about the promise that God made to Noah. We haven't got time to go through the story, but after Adam and Eve's rebellion against God's authority, things had not gone well for mankind. That's an understatement. We read of increasing violence, bloodshed on the earth, and God's verdict on the human race was pretty bleak. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Can't get much worse than that, can you? Now, the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. And God's plan was to make a new start through Noah and his family. Noah, who was described as a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. And we don't have time to retell the story this morning. Most of us will be familiar with it. And if you're not, you can read it later in Genesis chapters 6 to 9. Noah is told to build an ark, a floating barn, because God is going to bring a great flood on the earth. And there's lots of rain and a great flood, and Noah and his family and all the animals which he's taken with him are all saved from drowning. And eventually the flood waters subside and the ark comes to rest on dry ground on a hill, and Noah and his family are able to make a new start. And what's the first thing that Noah does when he comes to rest on the ground? Anybody remember what's the first thing that he does? He thanks God. He makes an altar and he sacrifices some of the animals to God. He gives up some of these animals, these precious animals, these animals that he's taken onto the ark, these animals that he was going to need to make a new start to life. And he presents them to God as a burnt offering. He acknowledges God and God's authority over the world. He makes a costly sacrifice to God. And then what did God do? We read that God made a covenant with Noah. And covenant is not a word we use very often, is it? We're more familiar with the term contract, such as the agreement that I may have with my house decorator. If you paint my house, I will pay you so many £100. Or if you do your homework, you will not have to stay for detention after school. If you do something, then I will do something else. It's a sort of two-way agreement. It's an if, which is backed up by rules or the law. But on the other hand, a covenant is a one-way promise. It doesn't depend on an if. It's a promise. It's a loving commitment, which is guaranteed by the law. And God makes a covenant with Noah, a promise that he will never bring such a flood again. So God says this, never again will I destroy all the living creatures as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. That's a great promise. And perhaps we come away from the story thinking that from the time of Noah, everything's going to be so much better for the human race. With the example of Noah and the promises of God, then humanity will look to God and live under his rule, and that humans will be able to resist the temptation to sin, the temptation to rebel against God. And if we're thinking that, then our hopes are soon dashed, because in the very next chapter of the Bible, we read of Noah's sin and the sin of his family. Now, the example of Noah isn't going to be enough to save mankind. Indeed, God is not under any illusion that things are going to get much better. When he makes his promise to Noah, he says, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood." Humans, that's you and me, are never going to be able to behave in such a way that we will be acceptable to God. We're born into a sinful world, and we don't have the strength to resist the temptation to sin. But the good news, which we read throughout the Bible, is that God's love for us, God's covenant, God's promise to us, doesn't depend on whether we deserve it, but it depends on his great love and his great mercy. And God has a much better and greater plan. A plan in which Noah is just one stepping stone along the way. A plan in which God himself will be born as one of us. God himself will take our sin upon himself. He will live in us and give us the power to begin to resist sin. And eventually he will restore us so that his image is again clearly seen in us, not spoiled by sin and selfishness. Jesus is God's plan for us. Let's remind ourselves again of God's promise to us through Noah. Just the second verse of that song we sang at the beginning of our service. Great is your faithfulness. This promise to Noah.